Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Turfgrass Epistemology. My name is TravisShaddox. Got a busy day today, and I'm going to be moving quickly. And this may be... we're going to be going over soil testing for whatever length of time. I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks, whatever it is. And today we're going to be talking about soil sampling specific to depth and timing. And after this, we're going to go over some other, more detailed information regarding soil sampling, and then we'll get into the scientific literature and so forth. But this episode, with regards to the practitioner, the person actually taking the sample, may be the most important episode. As you all probably know, if you've been listeners to the channel for any length of time, you probably know that I'm not an advocate for soil testing just for the sake of soil testing. There's a lot of flaws, there's a lot of errors, there's a lot of assumptions made with soil testing for turfgrass, specific for turfgrass. There is value to gain, there's good information to gain from soil testing in some situations, but just widespread use of soil testing to manage nutrients is, in my opinion, far overvalued. One reason is for the reasons I'm going to go over today, is that the sampling process itself is so fraught with error and there's so much variation in it that I find it difficult to have any confidence in the values, particularly when you're measuring values over time. And I'm going to make a case, I think a good case, why I am convinced that's true today. Okay? This is a members only stream. Good morning, Randy and Andrew. Randy's making me jealous, saying he's listening from the beach. You may be the first person to ever listen to this while you're on the beach. So I wish I were wherever you are. It was hot last week here in Lexington. It finally cooled off. We had a storm front come through yesterday. Barely got any rain at all, but I think it kind of pushed some of the humidity and some of the heat out. And this morning it was in the high 60s Fahrenheit. So it's much more comfortable today. And this week maybe 5 degree drop in temperature maybe compared to last week. So it's looking better this week. And then at the end of the day today, I'm going to go over I'm going to try to be polite. I'm going to try to be respectful to the person. I'm going to show a video at the end, and to the person, I want to make sure it's clear that I have no issue with the person, and I respect him as a human and as a person. His claims are utter nonsense, and I was given this video by one of my viewers, and I immediately replied, "Thanks if it's true." I doubt it's true. I doubt anybody could actually say those things. Well, I watched the video. I still don't believe it's true. Then I realized it was posted 3 years ago, and I started reading the comments on it, and I'm thinking, wait a second. Now I'm convinced it actually is true. And so I'm going to go over this video, and I'm going to explain in detail why the information this particular BS artist is communicating is utter nonsense, and show clear examples and explain with another video how the process actually works, what's actually going on, and that'll be at the end of the day. Okay. Good morning, Chuck. Okay, let's get into it because I want to give this particular episode due time because it's immensely important that we understand how to soil sample. And I don't know why I always have problems with this first little thing. Okay, I'm going to change my color here. Let's see if this helps see things a little clearer. Okay, so this is a presentation. It's a 4-hour presentation. I'm only going to go over an hour of it today, or maybe 45 minutes, whatever it is. This is a presentation I have given at the Golf Course Superintendent Association of America conference and trade show. I think I gave it last year. And I'm going to give it 1 hour, and then I'm going to go for the next 2 or 3 episodes. I'm going to continue it until I get done. All right. This first part is about soil testing and the actual process of sampling. I'm going to skip through the first couple of slides because they're not relevant to, I'm going to skip through all this. They're just saying hello and who we are and what we do, what I do, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the outline. I'm going to be going over risk factors And then throughout the remainder of this month and then into July, I'm going to talk about soil testing, the types of soil tests, the pH, salinity, sodicity, organic matter, phosphorus, and then report examples. That's for the next 2 or 3 episodes. Today, I'm going to talk about a little bit about risk and sampling depth and timing. So risk is anything that increases the probability of unacceptable turf grass. So it could be water, light, temperature, nutrients, injury, anything like that. Correlation, the risks are correlational, then they're not necessarily causal. It's important to make that distinction. I like this quote from Doug Soldat. I wish I would have said it before him because it's a genius quote. From Dr. Doug Soldat from the University of Wisconsin. He's actually the chair of the department there now. He says, if your soil test says nutrients are deficient, but the grass looks good, then the soil test is wrong. How many times have you heard me say that? If the grass looks good and there's no pre-existing condition, in other words, there's no historical concern of any nutrient deficiency and your turf grass looks fine, but the soil test says you need to apply nutrients, the soil test is wrong. Now, Dr. Doug Soldat is one of the more knowledgeable, respectable soil scientists in turf grasses. My background is in soil testing, specific in turf grasses, and I agree. I agree completely. And I imagine if I get on the other 2 or 3 or 4 other soil scientists who specialize in turfgrass soils, I don't imagine their opinion would be much different. Maybe they would. Maybe I'll get them on and ask them. But if the turfgrass, I'm going to go over soil testing. And the first slide is, if your turfgrass looks fine and there's no pre-existing condition, and the soil test says you need to apply nutrients, the soil test is what's wrong. Okay? Let's make sure that that's clear. It's not just coming from my channel. This is coming from numerous specialists in this specific area. 4 hours of soil testing. What's the big deal? Okay, so what's the big deal? Well, soil testing is correlated very strongly with applying more nutrients. The publication we published a couple of years ago, we looked at the amount of nitrogen that's applied to an 18-hole golf course. And nitrogen, I'm looking at a graph here where nitrogen in terms of pounds per 1,000 square feet per year. And we have the various areas of the golf course, natural areas, roughs, fairways, grounds, tees, greens, and practice areas. And then we're comparing those courses that soil tested to those golf courses that did not soil test. And this is on nitrogen. And we can see that in many of the locations, with the exception of natural area, actually every location with the exception of natural areas, golf courses that soil test apply greater amounts of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet than golf courses that do not soil test. Okay. Whether or not there is actually a cause there is a matter for another publication. But there's definitely a correlation here for nitrogen. If we look at the same areas of the golf course and we look at phosphorus, the black bars here, where we're looking at 1.25 pounds of phosphorus on practice areas when you did soil tests, or down below 1 pound of phosphorus on practice areas when you did not soil test. Okay. Greens are the same regardless of whether you soil tested or not, and roughs are greater if you did soil test. So there's no place on the golf course where less phosphorus is being applied because you soil tested. And you will hear over and over and over in marketing sheets and by respectable associations. And I'm going to show, I think it's in this episode, there's a university that's unfortunately one of my favorite universities. Okay. I love them. But they have a flyer that says, it's more environmentally sound or lower your environmental risk by soil testing. Well, that's not supported by the evidence. The evidence says that if you're soil testing, you're applying greater amounts of phosphorus. Now, the argument could be made, and there's no argument to be made against it yet because we don't have the data. But an argument could be made that this extra phosphorus is being applied indeed because it is deficient. Okay. Now, that argument is very weak because the argument actually doesn't have any evidence to support it. But there is no argument against it either because there's no evidence to support that either. In other words, we don't know if the turf grass actually required and actually was deficient in phosphorus. All we know is that when those courses that were soil testing, when they soil tested, they applied greater amounts of phosphorus than courses that did not. So if the courses that did not soil test had acceptable turf grass, and the courses that did soil test had acceptable turf grass, and they still applied more phosphorus, then that would be an argument against that. In other words, they're applying more phosphorus than they need, and they need to knock it off. But if the golf courses that did soil test were indeed deficient in phosphorus, then they would have an argument to continue that application. So we don't know that. This is a correlation. We don't know. We don't have any greater information to really, put a strong claim or strong position on whether or not indeed this is a problem. But there is a correlation between, you're not going to apply less if you soil test. You're going to apply more. And salesmen know that, by the way. Throw that in there. Good morning, Charles Douglas. Okay, potassium, same thing. Pretty much across the board on everything except natural areas. If you're soil testing, you're applying more potassium. You're applying about 3 pounds of greater amounts of potassium if you soil test on greens. 3 pounds, whereas you're only applying 2 pounds if you don't soil test. Let's look at the big areas like fairways and roughs. You're applying about 1.5 pounds if you soil test and 1.25 pounds if you don't in fairways, and about the same for roughs. So you are applying greater amounts of nitrogen, you're applying greater amounts of phosphorus, and you're applying greater amounts of potassium if you soil test than if you don't. So it's hard for me to argue how soil testing is environmentally safer than not soil testing when you see data like these. We continue a little bit more, and we see the question was on the survey, did you fertilize based upon soil test results? And if they said yes, they applied a golf course, an 18-hole golf facility, applied 4.4 tons per year. If they said no, they only applied 2.7 tons. Phosphorus was 0.6 if you soil tested, and 0.4 if you didn't. Look at potassium. 3 tons of potassium if you soil tested compared to 1.7. So you're applying double the amount of potassium if you soil tested compared to if you didn't. Okay, again, we don't know whether or not the turfgrass actually required it or not because no one's out there actually doing that analysis. But clearly I have yet to see any way we've ran the data show that soil testing resulted in fewer nutrients being applied in any scenario. Wish we had this for lawn care and for sod production and sport turf, but we don't. However, there is a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Here is the importance of factors when making nutrient applications decisions on golf facilities within the United States in 2006, 2014, 2021. Now, in 2006, you'll notice that soil analyses right here was up actually at the top. It was in 2006. It was the second, basically the number one is tied with number one in terms of its importance in making decisions in 2006. But you'll notice in 2014, it's dropped to probably looks like 4th or 5th on the list. It was in the top 2. Now it's in 2014. It was in the top 4 or 5. Then you go to 2021, and now it's dropped to the 7th most important factor influencing nutrient applications. Visual observations and scouting and weather, temperature, are at the top of the list, which I'm glad to see because visual observations, temperature, rainfall, water, all of these things have, in my opinion, are of greater importance and are more likely to result in an efficient use of your nutrients than relying on a soil test. So we're moving in the right direction. In other words, soil analyses are becoming less and less important when it comes to making nutrient applications on U.S. golf courses. Now, you've heard me say this before, don't soil test unless you have a good reason. And the reason I say that is because of the data I just showed. Clearly, there's a correlation. Don't know if it's a cause, but clearly there's a correlation between applying greater amounts of nutrients when you soil test than if you don't. Okay? And so don't soil test unless you have a good reason. If your turf grass is acceptable and you have no pre-existing condition, then you probably don't have a good reason. Okay? You probably don't. Okay, the argument is, well, shouldn't we take one annually or every 2 years so we have some sort of baseline? Okay, do it if you want to. I mean, You're soil sampling when the turf is perfectly fine. And the argument is, well, now we know what it is. Okay. As long as you're not applying nutrients based upon that, I don't have a problem with it. The problem I have is when people begin to apply nutrients based upon that soil test. That is where we start to see wasteful usage. Okay. And the environmental risk and the cost to your company, your profits start to go down because you're going to be applying more nutrients than the turf likely would need. And again, we don't know that, but it's likely that you're more likely to have that occur than if you don't soil test and you don't apply those unnecessary nutrients. It's important for me to point out that we're talking about applications of nutrients that are unnecessary. If it's necessary, then fine. Okay. If it's going to result in acceptable turf grass or increase the quality of your turf grass, then so be it. Now, this is a bulletin of the USGA Green Section published in 1925. And I've shown this before. If you've ever seen any of my live talks, I like to use this publication. This was published in 1925, and I was reading this article here called Methods of Applying Ammonium Sulfate and Ammonium Phosphate. And at the bottom of this, they used to put in these little blurbs at the bottom of the page. And it says here at the bottom, soil analyses, these are of practically no value. No one living can tell what they mean. This was in 1925. We've come a long way since then. I don't think we've come near as far as we need to go. I still think there's a huge, big black box of guessing when it comes to soil testing with turf grasses. We clearly we have better confidence in values now than we did in 1925, but I think it's still overvalued. I think the confidence in soil testing by the practitioner is greater than it should be. I just don't see a lot of value in it. Okay, unless you have a problem. Okay, you have a problem, then we can consider looking at soil tests. But the last thing you're going to need to do is look at a soil test and go, yes, my number should be this exact number. And if it's not, then I need to change my nutrient applications. That's a little bit naive, to say the least. I'll get into that as we go through the next couple episodes. Don't guess. Soil test so we can guess for you. Again, another quote by a peer of mine up at Michigan State who I was like, that's a great line. Man, that is a fantastic line. Again, I didn't come up with it. But fantastic line by another turfgrass specialist professor who has a similar opinion as I do. Don't guess, soil test. You heard that on a lot of marketing slides and some extension bulletins. And then he put in there so we can guess for you. And a lot of that is hyperbole, but some of it's not. I mean, there is like I said, there's a big black box of guessing. Okay, we don't know exactly what the number should be in all conditions. And until someone starts really supporting research and we start looking into those in greater detail over time, we're not going to know. We have general sort of ballpark numbers is what we have. Oh yeah, here it is. So here's the OSU, Oklahoma State's extension pamphlet that they have, and it's titled Soil Testing, the Right First Step Towards Proper Care of Your Lawn and Garden. And it's easy to say that. I get it. It's sort of like a traditional sort of thing that we say. Don't do anything until, and you might find some publications with my name on it somewhere in the past that says something similar to that. It's a very easy sort of thing to say. Don't do anything until you soil test. I mean, I hope I never said that, but it wouldn't shock me if my name's on something somewhere, or someone can pull something out and say, well, you used to say this 15 years ago. And so it's easy to say that. Okay. The reality is the correlations and calibrations required to have much confidence in these values is very weak. Okay. Very, very weak. Let's look on the next slide. So this is the front and the back and the inside of this trifold thing that Oklahoma State puts out. As you all probably know, I graduated from Oklahoma State in 90 whatever, 8 or 9, something like that. And they have like collecting good soil samples. They have sort of bulletin points that are, generally okay. It says sample lawns and gardens to a 6-inch depth, which I tend to agree with. Anyway, it goes through there. But then on the next page, the inside of this trifold, and I'm just using this as an example. You could probably pull up another 10 from universities that have a very similar statement. I just happened to come across the Oklahoma State one. And it says how to have a good lawn and garden. And then it has a brief paragraph or two about why soil test, benefits of soil testing, what is soil testing, and so forth. And what we're going to talk today about is sample depth and timing. And over here, you may not be able to read it on your screen because it's fairly small, but I'll read it for you. It says, when should soil be tested? And I'm going to highlight this because I've never actually come across this particular fallacy in a university publication. So I'm going to show it today. The best time to evaluate the nutrient status of the soil is during a time when plants, when plants aren't growing. Although any time of the year is satisfactory. Now I'm going to show on the next couple of slides where that's just completely ridiculous. You know, that's silly. To sample any time of the year, you're likely going to sample, if you do that, you're likely going to sample at times of the year when the soil values are very high, or could be sampling when the soil test values are very low or in the middle. And what we want to do is we want to soil sample at a time of year when it's likely that the nutrient values are at their lowest, meaning whenever they're at their lowest, that would give us an idea whether how susceptible that soil is to a nutrient deficiency, or the turfgrass is susceptible to a nutrient deficiency. So if it's at its lowest, let's take potassium. If the soil values are at their lowest, let's say in April, and the lowest value is 100 parts per million melic 3, then you're probably never going to encounter a potassium deficiency. But if the highest value throughout the year is 100 parts per million, but the lowest is at 20, and you didn't catch it, then your lawn, your golf course, whatever, during some times of the year might actually encounter a potassium deficiency. So sampling at any time of the year and saying it's satisfactory is not an evidence-based recommendation. Sorry, OSU. I love you. Then the next sentence says, in any case, it's more environmentally friendly to soil test than to guess about which fertilizers to use. And I felt compelling evidence to indicate that it's not environmentally friendly to soil test because people who soil test tend to apply more nutrients. Okay. And that fallacy, when it says it's more environmentally friendly to soil test than to guess, it's better to do this than that, is called a black or white fallacy. In other words, they're presenting two options as if those are the only two options, when in fact there's more options than just soil testing or guessing. For example, I could simply not apply anything and then apply something whenever a nutrient deficiency shows itself in the turf. That would be an option. You may disagree with it, but that would be an option, right? So there's more options than just soil testing or guessing, and that's called the black or white fallacy in one of OSU's publications. It's unfortunate. And then the last sentence just says, for your soil test to be as accurate as possible, collect the soil sample before fertilizer is applied and use the proper sampling procedures, which I agree with, obviously. And we're going to go into that today. So the point in this is not to bash OSU, because I love OSU. Okay, I could show probably one from Florida, and I could probably show one from Kentucky that says the same thing. Okay, the point is to point out that this information and this misinformation exists not only in the industry and sales and marketing and so forth, but also exists occasionally from universities as well. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Just so we're on the same page, where this is a soil test, this is a soil report on the screen here by NL Labs, and you'll see a variety of things. And what I want to point out is that you'll see values like organic matter, you'll see Bray 1, weak Bray, strong Bray. You'll see these values, but then you'll also see interpretations, which in this case is the H or the L, or the VH, which stands for very high and so forth. I just want to point out that this is a soil test that you typically encounter. We're looking for the values. The interpretation is where the problem comes in. The values, I have a great deal of confidence, are accurate and repeatable, but the interpretation is where this thing sort of falls apart. One of the greatest examples of pseudoscience and salesmanship is this soil test report, a masterpiece of nonsense and misinformation. And I left all the names and everything off of it, but this really is a perfect example. It's the best example I've ever seen of flooding someone with information so that you may perhaps make yourself look smart. You perhaps convince them on somewhere on this sheet, there's information that would convince them to buy a product from you because there's, I don't know how many, 30, 40, 50 different data points on this thing. And it has things that are valuable, but also that are just complete nonsense, like base saturation, critical ratios, calcium to potassium, calcium, magnesium, base saturation of calcium, and all these other things. And it has also things that are valuable, like, for example, phosphorus in parts per million. I'm assuming this was a Mehlich 3. I don't really know, or another valid extractant. Magnesium. It has all these other extracted values, but it just has a slew of soil solution. I'm assuming this is a saturated paste soil extract numbers, which are completely useless for everything except for pH and salinity. But they'll wow you with all these numbers, saying, "Oh, you're fine here with phosphorus on, let's say." In this case, it might be a tad low according to them, but they'll say, well, you're a little bit low here in extractable phosphorus, but your soil solution phosphorus is low, so you need to apply more phosphorus or whatever. That's the way they'll trick you. They'll say, well, the extracted value doesn't account for what's in solution, and so you need to use both. It's complete nonsense. It's ridiculous. And I'll explain exactly why that is as we go through the next couple of episodes. But basically, if there's no correlation with what's in solution, then I have no confidence in the number. And with extracted values, we have correlations, but with soil solution values, we do not. Well, for everything except for salinity and pH. Anyway, so this is really just absolute pure genius when it comes to salesmanship and pseudoscience. This pretty much, I'd say 90% of the values on this are just designed to wow you and confuse you and convince you to buying something that you probably don't need. And while there still is some valuable information on here, like phosphorus and potassium and pH and so forth. Okay. That's an example. Okay. So types of soil tests. We're going to be talking about almost entirely chemical soil tests. But we have chemical soil tests and we have physical soil tests. One of these two is immensely valuable to turfgrass soil scientists and to practitioners. And it's not chemical soil tests. Okay. The physical soil tests measure things like bulk density, percolation rate, porosity, particle size distribution. We have good confidence and good values, good numbers on what the physical properties of the soil should be or need to be in order to have a good confidence that our turfgrass is not suffering from some sort of deficiency or some sort of physical problem in the soil. We have good numbers on these. The chemical soil tests are where there hasn't been enough work done to really have much confidence in them. These are things like Mehlich extracts, Bray and Morgan extracts. The ion exchange resins are another example of pseudoscience and salesmanship that really commits a lot of people. These are a lot of the home tests. These are complete ridiculous, except for nitrates and some cool season grasses. There's just no numbers on these. Saturated pastes, again, have been shown numerous times to be useless for everything except for pH and salinity. And then there's soil health tests. I think soil health tests will eventually become valuable to us. Right now, the calibrations and the correlations with soil health and turfgrass quality aren't where I feel comfortable recommending them, but we are making headway on soil health tests, but I don't think we're there yet. The soil health test, if you're not familiar with it, will give you, they'll measure a number of soil health parameters and then they'll give you a value, a number, 70 or 80 or whatever, and they'll say, based upon that value, you should do something. Usually it's applying some sort of organic material or something like that. That may be valuable, but in terms of turfgrass and quality and response and all these things, I'm just not real confident in interpreting that soil health number yet. But this is where a lot of money is being spent and a lot of resources are being spent in the soil health square here. Whereas we're going to be talking almost entirely about Mehlichs and Brays and Morgans for the remainder of these next couple episodes. Okay, so just make sure everybody's on the same page. Okay, the soil testing process, it's pretty simple. You sample it. You send it for the lab for analysis. I'll do sample it. You send it for the lab for analysis. I'm all okay with this. Say okay. But then you have to do an interpretation of the values and then a recommendation. This is where this whole process sort of falls apart. The data interpretation, we're getting better at it. We have greater values now than we ever have, but it's still not as strong as I think it should be we're getting headway. We have general ballpark numbers, I think, to use in data interpretation. But this process must also be used when you're doing anything else, like those ion exchange resins and all these home tests that use these little beads. I'm not familiar with any data interpretation, calibration, or correlation on any of those tests, with the exception of, like I said, nitrates on cool season grasses in the New England area. There's a little bit there. But until I see anything like that, there's no reason for me to believe that they work, and I wouldn't use those. So sampling depth. So here we are, 38 minutes in, and I'm just not getting the sampling depth. Sorry, I had to get through that introduction. Okay, so sampling depth. Now, historical depth recommendations have been based upon agriculture, the plow layer, 6 inches, or an acre furrow slice. An acre furrow slice is 1 acre that's 6 inches deep. And what a furrow is, for any of the international audience who may not be familiar with the word furrow in English, a furrow is this plowed furrow, this plowed raised soil area. This is a furrow. Okay, and in agriculture, they'll plow that layer before planting. Okay, they'll either till the soil or they'll just have a plow, and that's usually about 6 inches deep. And that accounts for most row crop root depths, so corn or sorghum or soybeans or cotton or anything like that. Any of the crops that are for food or fiber, generally the roots are in the top 6 inches, and they plow to that top 6 inches, and that's what an acre furrow slice is based off of. And that's a lot of times what the historical soil testing depth is based off of, is that 6-inch soil depth. But turfgrass probably does not need to measure the top 6 inches. Most turfgrass roots are in the top 6 inches. But you can make an argument that there might be in the top 4 inches or top 3 inches, depending on the turf species. Okay. However, most soil test correlations and calibrations were based upon the 6-inch soil depth. So when they went out and they did the correlation and did the calibration, which was what I've done, I do it on a 6-inch soil depth. Okay. So if the calibration and the correlation is based on a 6-inch soil depth, the interpretation on the soil test and the recommendations on a soil test are going to be based upon 6-inch soil depth. So you can't thereby go out and just sample at 3 inches and then have the lab interpret it if it was done on 6 inches. And I'm going to explain why that is. Okay. Sampling depth, you will influence the amount of element. Okay, this is unpublished work by Dr. Soldat, but you can go in the literature and find dozens of papers that show a similar result. Where at the top 1 inch, his phosphorus was 200 parts per million. The top 2 inches, his soil phosphorus declined down to 140 parts per million. And in the top 3 inches, it was down to like 75 parts per million. So phosphorus is declining the deeper and deeper we go in the soil, from 0 to 1 to 0 to 2 to 0 to 3 and so forth. So it's being diluted essentially the deeper you go. So soil depth, sampling depth, has an influence on the amount of nutrients that are extracted in the soil testing process. So we have to first accept that that's true. And if you don't accept it's true, go read the literature. There's plenty in the literature that show that. Okay. For most nutrients, the concentration will decline the deeper you go. Now, sampling depth risks. So on the screen, I'm showing a profile, a 6-inch deep soil profile. Okay. This is a tall fescue. Now, if we assume, you don't have to, but for the sake of discussion today, we're going to assume that in this 6-inch soil depth, the critical limit through a correlation and calibration process, we determined that the critical limit was 20 parts per million Mehlich 3 phosphorus. Just for discussion, I'm not saying that's actually the critical limit. Let's just assume that that's the case. 20 parts per million at a 6-inch soil depth. What that means is anything greater than 20 parts per million phosphorus at a 6-inch soil depth probably wouldn't respond to applications of phosphorus. And anything less than 20 parts per million, the turfgrass may be in a deficient stage or phase of phosphorus, and you might need to apply phosphorus, and the turfgrass might respond to phosphorus. That's what that means. Let's just assume that we all agree on that's the case. Well, if you only sample in the top 2 inches, and that sample comes back at 10 parts per million phosphorus, you're probably correct that P is limiting. Okay? Because if you sample in the top 2 inches, and it's less than 20 parts per million phosphorus, and the 6-inch soil depth critical limit was 20 parts per million phosphorus, then you're probably correct. Okay, the soil sample being 10 parts per million at 2 inches is probably less than what it would be if you took a 6-inch soil depth soil sample. Okay, so in that case, the soil test recommendation may be of use to you. However, if you take a soil sample at 2 inches depth, or pick whatever, 3-inch depth, 4-inch depth, whatever, and the value came back 20 parts per million, remember the critical limit at 6-inch soil depth was 20 parts per million. Now you just sampled at 2-inch soil depth and it came back at 20 parts per million. You're probably incorrect. That P is not limiting. So at 20 parts per million in the top 2 inches, you might look at it, or the lab would look at it and spit it back and say, no, you're fine. That's what would probably come back from the lab, because the lab would look at it and say it's 20 parts per million. And if they assume the critical limit is 20 parts per million, they say, okay, you're probably fine. But in reality, the lab didn't know you sampled at 2 inches or 3 inches or whatever. And you're probably wrong if you assume that your phosphorus is not limiting. Because the 6-inch soil depth, if you had taken the 6-inch soil depth, it probably would have been less than the critical limit of 20 parts per million phosphorus, because it's going to be diluted the deeper you go. Okay? Well, let's say what happens if you do the sample at 2 inches and it comes back at 30 parts per million phosphorus. So this value is greater than 20 parts per million phosphorus. The lab's going to go, you're definitely fine. Don't worry about it. But you took it from the top 2 inches. Again, you may be incorrect that P is not limiting, because the 20 parts per million phosphorus at 6-inch soil depth, I don't know what the top 2 inches of phosphorus was during that calibration. I have no idea what it was. It might have been 30. It might have been 50. In Dr. Soldat's previous graph, he was showing that in the top 1 inch, it was 200. Okay, so because I didn't sample during the calibration and correlation experiment, I didn't sample just at the top 2 inches. I don't know what it was at the top 2 inches or the top 3 inches or the top 4 inches, whatever. I don't know what it was. But the lab's going to assume you did it at whatever depth they did their calibration, and they're going to send you back an interpretation and a recommendation based upon their data set. Then the data set being set on whatever depth they did. So this is why you can't just go out randomly and just start sampling at 2 inches or 3 inches or 4 inches or whatever if you don't know what the correlation and calibration was from the lab. So just call the lab. Say, what soil sample depth should I sample at? If they say 4 inches, then I'm going to assume, I would ask them, but I would assume that the 4-inch soil depth was the depth they used during the calibration and correlation phase. And I would ask the director of the soil testing lab, say, hey, well, what is that the depth you used? And if they say they don't know, then what's the point? You could be way off. And their recommendation could be completely useless or completely accurate. You don't know. Okay. So this is the value or the importance of knowing what depth the correlation and calibration was conducted on and following that. Okay. If they did it at 2 inches, then you're good. If they didn't and you're doing it at 2 inches, then I think your interpretation and any recommendations from the lab are a big fat guess, basically. Okay. Sampling depth influences conversions from pounds to acre to parts per million to pounds per acre. Soil test reports may show units in parts per million or pounds per acre. Make sure you're looking at the correct unit that you're basing your nutrient applications on. If you have parts per million and want pounds per acre, everybody is probably familiar with it. At a 6-inch soil depth, 1 part per million equals 2 pounds per acre. So you just convert it. However, especially on YouTube, you'll see a lot of people saying, well, let's say it's in pounds per acre. They go, well, your potassium is at 60 pounds per acre, so you're at 30 parts per million. Well, how do you know? The only way you can make that conversion if it was done at 6 inches, because if it was done at 3 inches, 1 pound per acre equals 1 part per million. Okay? And this is based upon the weight of the acre furrow slice at 6 inches, and now you've only done it at 3 inches. So it's an easy mathematics. So if you don't know the depth the soil sample was taken from, and you don't know the depth the correlation and calibration was conducted on, I'm not sure why you would even bother going out and soil sampling. What's the point? Because you could be drastically off, not by 5%. I don't care about 5%, 4%. I don't care about that. Even 10%. I'm like, whatever. It's agriculture. You can be off. Okay, you can be a little bit off. But you can be off by a factor of 2 or 3-fold. You could be thinking, I got 40 parts million phosphorus, when in reality, you only have 10 or 15 based upon the calibration. If you did it to 6 inches, you're off by many magnitude off. It's that potential. It has that potential to be flawed. Sampling depth. It is probably the greatest source of error. Absolutely. And I don't have any data to back that up. This is just anecdotal, but I think the soil sampling depth is the greatest source of error in this whole process. Sample the same depth every time. I cannot stress that enough. If you sample at 5 inches and then next time you sample at 6 inches, don't assume, that's no big deal. It is a big deal. You can have a much higher concentration of nutrients at 5 inches than you do at 6 inches. You're diluting it essentially by another 15 or 20%. Potentially. Okay. Ideally 6 inches, because correlations and calibrations were also conducted on 6 inches. In most cases, soil testing labs will have conducted their calibrations and correlations on 6 inches because in most cases, 5 or 10% of their samples are turf grass. 90% or more are from ag. Okay. So in many, many cases, not every, the calibration correlation will have been conducted for agriculture, and it will have been conducted on 6-inch soil depths. And if you determine from your lab that it was not conducted at 6-inch soil depths, then that's fine. Just adjust your depth to that depth. Now, what I do is I actually put some sort of apparatus on my soil sampler so that it samples the same depth every time, and I physically can't push it in the ground any further. Now, I'm going to change this back to red. I tried to change it to a different color. Right here, you'll notice on the soil probe, there's a little etching here that tells you it's 6 inches, but it doesn't stop the probe from going in. So you can weld some bolts or some nuts on the outside of your soil sample depth probe, and it'll never go any deeper than that at 6 inches or 4 inches, whatever depth you decide you're going to do with that. But then you're stuck with it. You can't take the piece off. It's stuck at that depth every time because it's welded. Other people have put on a hose clamp, like a metal or stainless steel hose clamp, and put the screw on the outside of the probe so that when you screw it down and tighten it up, you can then change it. But that outside, the screw being on the outside of the probe will physically stop the probe from going in. It does tend to kind of move up over time if you really get strong with it and you really start pushing the probe in firmly. And it's kind of a pain in the neck because the little band that's now going to be on the front of the probe is going to stop the soil from going up, and it's kind of hard to get out. But anyway, you got to find some way to stop that soil probe at the same depth every single time. Otherwise, I don't really have much confidence in measuring your nutrients or looking at your nutrients from past soil tests if you can't convince me that the sample was taken at the same exact depth every time. Okay, within, like I said, 5 or 10% error. But sampling it sometimes at 6 inches and sometimes at 4 inches isn't going to fly. This actual instrument, which I'm showing on the screen, is a soil profiler. I find much more value in a soil profiler than a soil sampling probe. Taking this out to the field, pushing it into the ground, this flap here at the bottom actually comes open and you can actually see the soil profile. This will give you an idea more of the physical characteristics of your soil. It won't give you any chemical characteristics, but it'll give you an idea of what you're dealing with, and you can take the soil sample from there if you choose to. It's really hard to push in, especially on tight soils, but I find this to be much greater value. You can see sometimes the thatch depth, much more clear. There's more information to gain, I feel, from a profiler than from a soil sample probe. Sample timing. Let's look at timing. What time of year should you sample? I get this question, not that common, but I do get it. And like I showed you in the university pamphlet, is sample any time of the year. No, don't sample any time of the year. That's absurd. Okay. So let's look at what sample timing you should at least consider. So this is a publication from Crop Science in 2002, and the graph here says influence of soil sample timing on soil test potassium. This was in Bermuda grass in North Florida, and this was using Malic 1 on potassium. And they sampled in May, they sampled in July, and then they sampled in October. So spring, summer, and fall. And on the x-axis, you're looking at a number of increasing amounts of applied potassium, all the way from 0 to, I don't know what, I guess 3/4 of a pound per 1,000 per 3 months. I guess that's what that is. I could be wrong. I'm doing that in my head, sorry. So if you look at what's sampled in May, you'll see that the 0 potassium was around 15, 16. And then as you apply more potassium in May, you see these increases in potassium go up to, 30 or 40 parts per million Mehlich 1 potassium when it was sampled in May. When you sample in July, you actually see the values go up for everything a little bit. For the 0, it went from maybe 17 to 18 from the 0 when you're not applying any potassium. And you'll see the potassium obviously increase the more and more potassium you apply, but it also increases from May to July. And this is Bermuda grass, so we're growing grass right now in the middle of July. When you go to October, you see, again, a little bit of an increase from the 0K, from about 17 in May to about 18 in July to about 20 in October, okay? And you'll see this continue to increase. The same trend holds true for any amount of potassium that you apply. Okay, so the greatest amount of potassium from the soil extract occurred in October, being the fall, and the least amount occurred in May. So in this case, I would want to consider applying or taking a soil sample in April or May prior to applying any nutrients and at a time when the potassium in the soil was at its lowest. Let's look at the influence of sampling timing on soil test phosphorus for bluegrass. Now we're looking at the months of the year on the x-axis and extractable phosphorus on the y-axis. We're looking at September, October, November, all the way through to the next September. And you'll see that the phosphorus goes up in November and December, and then gradually goes down. February, March, April, May being its lowest around May, June, and then goes back up in August and September, and then the highest amount was in November and December. So in this case, I wouldn't want to be sampling here in November and December. I'd want to be sampling here in April, May, June timeframe when it's at its lowest. Okay? That you have to be at least aware that the soil extractable nutrients will change month to month. So I can't just go out randomly and just start taking soil samples whenever I want. I need to determine in my location when would likely be the greatest chance of having the lowest amount of extractable nutrients. And it's probably going to be, let's say in warm season grasses, if you've applied nutrients all summer and the grass stops growing in, say, October, November, and then you're going to start growing grass again in March or April, and I would take samples in February or something. In other words, the longest length of time possible from the time the grass stopped growing in the fall, but before I start applying nutrients in the spring, that's likely to be the lowest nutrients in the soil. Whereas in cool season grasses, you have two peaks. The summer is going to be the lowest, and then the fall is going to go back up and down in the winter. So you need to determine when is the longest length of time between when the grass is stopped growing and before I start applying nutrients the next time. That's likely going to be the lowest nutrient concentration. In this case with bluegrass, it was in April or May. When you look at potassium for the same study, bluegrass, this is an Agronomy Journal 1967, you see a very similar trend where November, December were the greatest amounts of potassium were in the fall and the early winter, and the lowest were in April and May. Okay? So this is so for whether warm season or whether for cool season, there's data to support the management practice of taking sampling in the spring before you start applying nutrients. However, if you look in the literature, you'll find nutrient applications can be the lowest in other months too, depending on where you live, depending on what grass you're growing, what crop you're growing. Corn is definitely different than this. If you're growing corn, we're growing grass, but it can differ greatly. So the point here is not to say you must soil sample in the spring before you apply any fertilizer. I don't soil sample at all, and I'm fine. But if you're going to soil sample, you need to do a little bit of background and figure out, okay, am I going 2 months between fertilizer applications? Am I going to stop everything in October, November? My last application is going to be there, and then I'm not going to apply anything else until March? If that's the case, then try to take the sample 2 or 3 weeks before you start applying fertilizer from that longest gap of nutrient applications, if possible. That would be my recommendation. Or find the extension office or the land grant institution in your area and ask them. They may already know this is generally when the nutrients are in their lowest. This is the general time of year when they're at their lowest, and they may already have that information for you. Depth and timing importance. The impact, okay, the depth and timing importance. Why are these important? They impact soil test results. The result is perhaps the greatest variation. Depth and timing result in perhaps the greatest variation. So if you're taking the same depth, it's the exact same depth every time, but one year you take it in June, the next year you take it in October, the next year you take it in February, that is going to have a great deal of variation in it, just the time of year you did it. Or you could do it the same time every year at the same time, but if you change the depth, that's going to have a great influence on the concentration of nutrients as well. All of this is in your hands. You are in 100% control of this. The lab has no control over it. The salesman has no control over it. The university has no control over it. You are in control of the depth, and you are in control of the time that you do it. So it's critical that these two variables, because they are the greatest influencers on error, are accounted for as best you can. Okay? Be consistent, or your results will not be. Okay? And I'm going to go into testing methods on the next episode. So that's all we're going to do today on this one. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch, and I'm going to, let me answer a question first. Let me get out of this little thing here. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to answer a question real quick from Randy. He says, best after your rain season. Well, it can be, okay, after your rainy season. However, in Florida, the rainy season is June, July, August. I mean, it's raining in the middle of the summer every day at 3 o'clock. I remember when I first time went to Florida in 97, I think it was. I was working on a golf course down near Hope Sound in Stewart, just north of Hope Sound. Well, people don't know where, let me think where. It's north of West Palm Beach, about 30, 40 minutes north of West Palm Beach. And we went home at 3 o'clock. I didn't even have to have a watch. I really didn't. I would just stay on that mower, and as soon as it started raining, I would just start heading for the shop, because I knew it was like 2:30, 2:45 every single day. It was the same thing. It changed a little bit, and there for several years it changed, but it's the same time every day in Florida. It rains all summer long like that, and it rains for 20 minutes and then it's done. But in Florida, the rainy season is in the summer, and it doesn't rain. In usually January, February, it doesn't rain. Well, in Florida, you'd want to be sampling when it's not raining. After the rainy season is when the nutrients are the greatest, is in the fall. That's the evidence we have. The idea, Randy, the idea that you have that after the rainy season, after the rain maybe perhaps have pushed all the nutrients down, is a sound idea. You have at least a good reason to have that recommendation, and that may be true in some locations around the world. But to me, the best time is to, like I said, figure out when your turfgrass cycle ends, if it ends. And in Fort Lauderdale, it never ends, but it slows down in December. Okay. If you're in Naples or Fort Myers or in Southern California, it's never going to end. It just keeps growing all the time. Southern Texas, it never ends. It just slows down in December and January, right? Well, if that's the case and it's slowing down in December and January, and you're going to be putting out fertilizer applications in February, then try to do it 2 or 3 weeks before that fertilizer applications where you expect the grass to really start growing again. In most cases around the world, around the United States, you're not growing grass 365 days a year. You have a season. So when the season ends, that's probably when the nutrients are at their greatest. Let it, or could be. Let the time go, give it a month or two, and then look on the calendar, say, okay, I'm going to put out fertilizer March, April, whatever that time is, back up 2 or 3 weeks and do a sample then if you're going to do it. That would be my take on it. That may or may not be the rainy season. Okay. Okay, so let me get into this video. I was given a video link by, I believe his name was something Pharaoh in my comments of one of my videos. And he said, I've spoken with this guy about whatever, and he is discussing on his channel about fertilizer burns, which is fine. But this is the Pharaoh gentleman saying, well, he's talking about the temperature of the fertilizer heating up, and that's what causes the burn. And I'm like, no, no, he didn't. My first response was, and you can even read my reply, thanks if it's legit. My first response was, this isn't legit. There's no way. There's no way someone's actually going to say that or say that. If you're in the turfgrass industry, you're not going to believe that. You're definitely not going to put it on YouTube. But apparently I was wrong. So I didn't say anything about it until now because I went back and watched the video. And the video was from 3 years ago. And it's still up. And the gentleman whose video it is still discussing this on his comments as if what he's saying is actually accurate, as if he doesn't realize what he's saying is inaccurate. So that is the definition of BS. He's not lying. In order to lie, you actually have to know what the truth is and then say something contrary to that. He doesn't know the truth. He's just saying this information. He believes it's true. I'm assuming he believes it's true. I don't know what he believes. But he's doing something to try to convince you that he's, knowledgeable in this area. I don't know what his intention on distributing this misinformation is. I don't know what his intention is. But it's clearly misinformation. Okay. And so I wanted to show it, but it just, there's still a part of me thinking, I don't think that it's legit. I still think there's a part that's like, okay, he's going to come out and say this was an April Fool's joke or something. He's going to come back and say, yeah, I pointed, I just put this up as a goof. Because it's hard for me to fathom how someone in the turfgrass industry can be, can believe this. It just makes no sense. And so what I want to do is try to get this up and get it running without screwing it up. So the video is from, unfortunately, the Lawn Care Nut again, and it's called, Can You Fertilize the Lawn in Summer and Not Burn It? Oh, I'll give you the answer to that right now. Yes, of course you can. Fertilizer goes out all the time in the summertime. Thousands and thousands and thousands of acres go out all the time in the summertime. And some of it's going to burn, some of it won't, but that has nothing to do necessarily with the summer. Okay. It has to do with other factors. It's not just because it's the summer. So let's watch this video. There's only I'm only going to show a couple of minutes of it, but basically the gist of it, he's on his lawn for those listening. I'm assuming it's his lawn. And he's talking about fertilizer burn just in general. And now he's going to talk about the fertilizer particles and how they may actually impart an effect on the burn. And I'll do what I can to keep this thing running. Here we go.
Handling that fine. If I come over here in the garage and I grab a little fertilizer, this is a little leftover of our starter fertilizer that I have. Now in the garage, these prills are probably 80 degrees or so. They actually feel cool because they've been in that bag. Maybe they're 70 degrees. Doesn't really matter. They're definitely inside the garage and they're cooler. Now if I take these out here and I bring them out here, what's the hottest that they're going to get?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how hot they're going to get. Let's see what he thinks.
That's right, 89 degrees.
Oh my God. Oh my God. I mean, it's easy to get, start pointing the finger at people and making fun of people or whatever. I don't really fault people, especially when they're live on YouTube or they're trying their best. I don't fault people for being wrong. I'm wrong I'm wrong a lot. This guy's probably wrong a lot. That's not the issue. The issue is when you've been informed that you're wrong and shown evidence that you're wrong and you continue to peddle this misinformation. Okay. That's one of the most ignorant things I've ever heard in my life. The fertilizer is going to remain the same temperature when it's outside in the sun. It's only going to be the ambient temperature, 77 degrees or whatever, 80 degrees. How do you think that? I'm going to show you infrared data just so we're 100% clear that just because it's 86 or 87 or 85 degrees outside doesn't mean that the surfaces remain that temperature. Or these particles are going to remain that temperature. That's silly. And the temperature of the particles has nothing to do with burn anyway. I'm going to show you a video on that and explain this so everybody understands. fertilizer burn has zero to do with the temperature of the actual fertilizer. I mean, unless you go out with boiling, liquid urea or something and dump it out in boiling water, that might kill the grass. That's the silliest thing I ever heard in my life. So I'm going to take the higher ground here and try to help this gentleman through this rather than ridicule him for saying these ignorant things. And it just blows me away. It's really disappointing to see someone with this much impact in our industry be so wrong. That's fine, but yet not correct himself when he's informed that he's wrong. And the reason we need to address these claims rather than attack the person is because we need these people to come back to the center, to reality. Ridiculing them and making fun of them and calling them names. I get frustrated with ignorance. I do. But calling the person names isn't going to help bring them back. Most of the time, they're going to be more resistant to it. You're going to have a backfire effect. They're going to double down, basically. They're not going to say, you know what, I was wrong. Help me understand this. Most people aren't going to do that when you attack them. Okay, so I'm going to look at the claims, and we're going to go through the claims with the other videos and some more information to help this person understand how fertilizer burn actually occurs. And I suspect this was 3 years ago. He probably knows now that fertilizer burn doesn't occur this way, but yet the video, the misinformation that he's still peddling from 3 years ago remains up on YouTube. Continue.
Because that's how hot it is out here. So if these prills are 89 degrees, how would 89 degree prills burn a lawn that's already handling 89 degree temperatures?
Yeah, it wouldn't. It has nothing to do with it. The temperature of the fertilizer granule has absolutely nothing to do with fertilizer burn. What it does have to do with fertilizer burn is water potential, which I'm going to go over in a minute.
It's like sometimes people think the fertilizer is magic hot bullets or something, and it's going to heat up to some 250 degree lava when you put it out there. It's not the case. It's a physical thing that can only get as hot as its surroundings, just like everything else in the world. So
that's not true. I still hold a little bit of confidence that I still think maybe he's going to come out and say that this was all just a spoof. He was just creating this just to see who would attack him or something. I don't actually think he thinks that. It's hard. It's just difficult for me to imagine someone can provide that much ignorant information. It's astounding to me. That just blows me away.
there isn't going to be any extra heat generated when you apply outside. Now, some of you might be thinking, yeah, but Alan, what if some of those prills actually sit on the grass blades? Well, there's actually three things to think about there. Number one is they're only going to be 89 degrees, but number two, without water, they're not going to release their nutrient. I'll set these right here, and you will see I could come back 2 or 3 hours from now, and they'll still be sitting there just like that. They will not have changed. It's not like something happens that they break down. They got to have water for that. And
yeah, and they do get, oh my God. Jesus Christ. Okay. If you're in the middle of the Sahara Desert or the Death Valley, Arizona, or California, wherever, then maybe they would be there for hours. That's true. Maybe they'd be there for days because the humidity is so low. But those fertilizer particles, not so much the KCl or the coated product, they might take a little longer to absorb water. But they're going to absorb humidity because the water potential in those prills is much, much, much lower than the atmosphere. So they're going to absorb water. And if there used to be a company in Tampa called Nitram, they used to synthesize ammonium nitrate. And I think they've shut down. They're no longer there anymore. But I went over there when I was, 20-something years ago. And they have piles of ammonium nitrate the size of buildings, okay? And from those piles, you have to kind of walk on the high ground. Why? Because there's a stream of water coming out from those piles. There's so much absorption of moisture out of the atmosphere that they collect that moisture, they absorb that moisture, and it goes to the bottom of the pile and starts coming out the bottom. It drains out those piles of ammonium nitrate. Okay. They're not watering the ammonium nitrate. Okay. It's absorbing it out of the air. We're going to talk about that in a minute. I'm going to skip ahead to 8:49 and maintain my sanity here. Okay, here we go. The next little clip here, I want to show this and we'll get to the good stuff.
Some of you will ask, Alan, I know, but I've seen burn lawns before. And yes, you can burn a lawn with granular fertilizer, but that's because something was done off-label, and it's not always on purpose. For example, if you spill fertilizer in the lawn, you spill a pile of it, it doesn't matter if it's 70 degrees out or 90 degrees out, that spot's going to burn. That isn't because of heat, though. That is because an overabundance of nutrient, typically nitrogen, was put onto the grass and it just blew it right out. It's just too much for it to handle. This is exactly why dog pee spots burn. Dog pee is urea, and it gets let out into the lawn, and it's concentrated in one spot, and it's way too much for that area, so the grass just dies. That has nothing to do with heat. So many of you guys experience dog death spots right after the winter time because it's too much nitrogen, nothing to do with heat.
Okay, that's not true, just so you know. But that I won't really fault him on that. I mean, it's misinformation. He doesn't really care what he's saying is true. If he cared what he's saying is true, he would remove this video 3 years ago. But that is very common misunderstanding that dog urine spots burn the grass because of high nitrogen or because of the salts that are in the urine. That's a common misconception. The reality is the salts in the urine, whether it's male or female dogs, have only a very small effect on the burn. The nitrogen has almost no effect on the burn. And what it is in there is lactic acid. And I'm going to show for sure one publication. I think I might actually have 2 publications on the effects of dog urine on turfgrass burn at some point in the future. And the scientists determined, this isn't published, you can Google it and probably find it. The scientists determined that it was the overwhelming cause of burn was a result of the lactic acid in the urine. I won't really fault him for that because that's pretty common in the industry to assume that that's the case, but it's not the case. It is lactic acid. Again, he doesn't really care. Okay, so now what I want to do now is I want to show a couple things. I'm going to show a video here for about a minute on, oh wait, no, it's not about a minute. It's about 2 or 3 minutes on water potential. This video comes from a huge YouTube channel, 1.37 million subscribers, called Bozeman Science. And the title of this is Water Potential. And this gentleman does a very good job of explaining it. And at the very end of the 2-3 minute clip here I'm going to show, he talks about plants. So I've said when the other gentleman, the lawn care net was on, he's talking about the temperature of the fertilizer. It doesn't heat up. You don't have to worry about it because you don't have to worry about it. It is going to heat up. I'll show you that in a minute. But it doesn't matter. That doesn't have anything to do with burn. It has to do with water potential. And now this gentleman is going to explain to us exactly how water potential influences water movement. And particularly sodium chloride, but you can replace it with potassium chloride or ammonium sulfate or any salt, okay? Let's show it here.
With a bunch of formulas, let's get started and talking about how water potential works. Let's first talk about osmosis. And if you don't know this, you may want to watch the video on osmosis. But if you wanted to do something really cruel, you could pour salt on a slug. Don't do it. It'll kill it. But what it would do is it would shrivel up that slug. And so what would happen is it would pull water out of the slug. Now, why does that occur? Let's zoom in to the surface of the slug. So let's say this represents a cell membrane on the outside of the cells of the slug. We've got water on the outside, water on the inside. And let's say we add just 1 crystal of sodium chloride or salt. Sodium chloride is going to be made up of 2 ions that are bonded together using an ionic bond. And when we add that to the water, something weird happens. They'll break apart into their 2 ions. We've now got the chlorine ion and the sodium ion, the negative and the positive charge. And the negative charge is immediately going to be surrounded by the positive parts of the water, and the negative sides of the water are going to surround the positive sodium. But look what it did. It opened up all these areas. So it decreased the water potential above the slug or on the surface of the slug. And so now we have areas where the water inside the slug can move into that. And it's more radical than I have in this simple kind of a diagram. So what it's going to do is it's going to move water outside the slug. And so we measure water potential on either side of that membrane. On the outside, it's going to be negative 40 bars. And on the inside, it's going to be negative 5 bars. Now know this, pure water is going to be right at 0 bars of water potential. And so the water is going to flow from here into here. So the water is going to flow from an area of high water concentration to low concentration. Or it's going to flow from an area of high water potential now to low water potential. And that's what you want to remember. Water's always going to flow from high to low water potential. And so this drives water even up a tree. And so if you were to pour some distilled water below a tree, that's going to have a water potential of 0 bars. But the roots are going to be around -2. And that's because they have a lot of solutes or salts inside them.
Okay, so real quick, just make sure we're clear. If he pours water in the soil, it's going to be at around 0 bar. Now, field capacity is about a -3 bar, something around that number. The roots are going to be at -2. It's going to move from higher to lower water potential. Now, if that distilled water, if you poured water around the roots and it was saturated, and let's assume that distilled water is 0. Let's assume the water in the soil is, say, 0, or you could say a -3 bar if you want to. And you added a salt like ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate. Urea is not a salt, but if you added urea, if you added pretty much any synthetic fertilizer, it's going to have an influence on the water potential of the soil around the roots. It's going to lower the water potential from 0 or a -3 bar to less than the -2 bar at the roots. Okay? It's going to lower it much more than that, to be honest, much lower than -2 bar. So when the fertilizer actually gets applied to the soil, if it's a synthetic salt, then the reason why excess amounts of synthetic fertilizers burn plants is because you've lowered the water potential in the soil lower than the plant roots or the plant roots, just say the plant roots for now. So the water is not going to move from the soil to the roots. It's going to move from the plant or the roots to the soil. In other words, you're changing the water potential and you're desiccating the plant. You're depriving the plant of water because you've changed the water potential in the soil. When you apply it to the plant leaf surface, you've essentially done the same thing, where if you apply like really fine grade ammonium sulfate, or if you spray out ammonium sulfate and it sticks on the leaf, urea will do the same thing at high enough rates. If you're spraying these nutrients out and it's sticking on the leaf surface, oftentimes it can be very beneficial, very valuable. But if you do it at too high of a rate, you're going to likely result in a tip burn, or even a really fine powdered ammonium sulfate or any salt. If it's wet and it sticks on a leaf, you've lowered the water potential of that leaf lower than the water potential in the leaf, and it's going to start to desiccate that leaf. It's going to pull water out of the leaf into the salt, or into the salt solution outside the leaf surface if it's wet. That's one reason why dry turf grass generally won't burn from foliar or granular applications compared to wet turf grass, and same thing with sprayable. If you want this to spray it out and you don't want to burn, that's the reason you need to go out at very low rates. If you spread it out in the morning, if you're going to go out and you're going to spread from 7 a.m. until 7 p.m., there's a greater likelihood that the burn will occur on the early lawns first, the ones you applied before the dew burned off, if you didn't water it in, than you did after lunch, because the moisture on the leaf surface might unintentionally dissolve some of that nutrient and leave it on the leaf surface, changing the water potential and resulting in some desiccation of that leaf area, burning the grass. That's what burn is in the world of plants. I'm going to go back and finish this video. There's just a couple, like 30 seconds left.
And so the water is going to flow in through osmosis, but the stems are going to have even a lower water potential, and the leaves as well, and even the atmosphere. And so the water is moving up a tree along this water potential gradient. Now, what's driving that? We're evaporating all the water up at the top, so there's not much water there at all. Really, really low water potential if we were to look at the leaves of the plant.
Okay, so the diagram he has shows a tree, and it shows the bars, the water potential changing from -2 in the roots all the way up to, say, -15 in the leaves. This is how water moves in plants. And fertilizer burn is a result of messing with that. Okay, that's basically what it is. You're screwing around with the water potential unintentionally. That's what causes a burn, not the physical temperature of the fertilizer prills. I don't even know how in the world, in my wildest dreams, I would have never thought that someone would misunderstand fertilizer burn to be a result of the temperature of fertilizer prills themselves. That's the most amazing thing I've ever heard. I'm shocked that would even appear in someone's mind, much less show up on YouTube. It's amazing. So now let me go to the last little bit here. I want to show you some temperature influences on surfaces. And I'm going to do this with some photos that I posted on my Twitter account ages and ages ago. I'm hoping I can get this done without somehow messing it up. So the other claim in the Lawn Care Nuts video was that the temperature of the fertilizer particles are never going to get greater than the ambient temperature, basically. Okay? That's absolutely absurd. I mean, I don't know where on earth you would come up with that, but he came up with it. I mean, even my 7th grade, well, not even that, my 3rd grade daughter knows that when you go outside in the sun with a white shirt on, it's cooler than if you go outside in the sun with a black shirt on. The black shirt's going to absorb heat and the white shirt is going to reflect heat. She knows that. But somehow this gets on YouTube. So this is a photograph I took from a forward-looking infrared instrument on dwarf Bermuda grass in Gainesville, Florida at 10 a.m. on August 18th in 2015. And what I'm showing here is the influence of fairy ring, resulting in an increased temperature compared to the turf grass that does not have fairy ring. Okay? So the surface temperature can be influenced by a number of things. Okay? The surface temperature of the fairy ring looks like it was 101, and the surface temperature of the surrounding the average was 106, and the surface temperature of the turf grass not affected by fairy ring was around 98 degrees. Okay, so that'll influence the surface temperature of surfaces. This is again an infrared photograph I took of Tiff Eagle, where I'm putting out different colors of sand. The yellow in this photograph is where the sand was green, and the purple was where the sand was white. So the purple is where the turf grass was cooler, and the yellow was where the turf grass was hotter. The green sand resulted in a hotter surface. The white sand resulted in a cooler surface, and you can see on the photograph here. If I'm sorry for those listening, we're looking at sort of purple squares where there is white sand, and yellow squares where there's green sand. Obviously, the sand is absorbing heat from the sun differently based upon their color. Here's foliar iron. Foliar iron can actually increase the temperature. This might actually be a benefit if you're growing warm season grasses in the shoulder seasons where you might want the temperature of the surface to be a little warmer. Foliar iron will increase the surface temperature of turf grass. It may be a disadvantage if you're trying to grow cooler grasses in the shoulder seasons or in the summer, whatever. You don't want that turf grass to be that hot. So if you're applying foliar iron on cool season grasses in the summertime and you're having a lot of stress show up and you want to spray out that iron to mask that stress, it might mask it, but it might actually have an opposite effect because it's going to be increasing the temperature substantially compared to not applying the foliar iron. Nitrogen itself might actually influence the canopy temperature. Here I'm showing an infrared photograph of 1 pound of nitrogen as polymer-coated urea 2 months after application. The surface temperature is 96 degrees Fahrenheit in Fort Lauderdale, compared to no nitrogen application. In other words, didn't apply any nitrogen at all. It was 101 degrees Fahrenheit. When I'm applying 1 pound as a polymer-coated, the surface temperature is 96 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? And in the photographs, you're seeing a dark purple square where it's 96 degrees from the nitrogen application and a more yellowish purple square rectangle when I did not apply nitrogen. This grass, where it was 96 degrees Fahrenheit, was much greener. It was much more. It had more growth on it. It was more dense, and the no nitrogen plot was, I wouldn't say barren. It wasn't very dense and wasn't very green. So that can have an effect. But let's just look at surface itself. No plants. This is artificial grass in 2015. I took this photograph at 10:30 a.m. on August 17th of 2015 in Gainesville, Florida. Now, the grass that's just normal grass, so this must have been Bermuda. I don't know if this is Bermuda over here on the left or not. I can't remember. But it was natural grass, was 94 degrees Fahrenheit at 10:30 in the morning, 94 degrees Fahrenheit. The artificial grass, which was right next to it, was 116 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, I don't know what the ambient temperature was back then, but at 10:30 in the morning, it wasn't 116 degrees Fahrenheit. I can guarantee you that. I don't know if it's ever been 116 degrees Fahrenheit in Gainesville, Florida. So the ambient temperature, let's say the ambient temperature was 90, 95. The surface temperature of that artificial turf was 116 at 10:30 in the morning. Okay? No nutrients. Obviously, it's artificial grass. Nothing sprayed on it. So to say that the particles, fertilizer particles, or any surface is going to be this, it's not going to get higher than the temperature, the ambient temperature, is preposterous. It's ignorance to a level I don't think I've ever encountered. The absorption of heat based upon the number of factors, but primarily the color, but there's a number of factors that influence the absorption of heat. But the color of the material itself will have an influence on how hot that particle gets, and it has nothing to do with turfgrass fertilizer burn at all. Anyway, I don't even know why you brought it up. Okay, so that's what I have on those videos. Misinformation to a degree that is just just astounding. I don't even know what to say about it other than wow. Just massive amounts of misinformation. It's okay to be wrong. I'm wrong. He's going to be wrong. If you're on YouTube Live, you're going to say something that's not entirely accurate. You may not realize it, but I mean, I try to be accurate. I try to be correct and evidence-based as best I can, but you talk this much, eventually you're going to say something that's not quite right. I don't mind that so much. What I do mind, and what I think is important for our society, is to acknowledge them when you're wrong, take a couple steps back, and try to recalibrate your beliefs a little bit. Okay, this is epistemology. How do you know? Well, if you were wrong, like I said, back up. Okay, get a little bit more information, help someone educate you a little bit, and then hopefully remove any known misinformation. It's going to be hard for him to do that. I'm sure he's making money off that video. But we don't want to be the sources of misinformation when we know and we've been shown that indeed we are the source. I mean, we want to minimize that as best we can. Okay, guys and gals? Last question from Andrew Burse. Do I take the soil sample from 5 to 6 inch range or from the whole 6 inch depth? Yeah, it's the whole 6 inch depth. So I'll put the probe all the way down. I don't remove the grass, the top. The lab does thousands and thousands of soil samples. They're much better at that than I am. And I think if I'm removing the turf, well, you could if you're particularly skilled at it. But if I'm removing the turf and the thatch or whatever I'm removing, the chances of me screwing it up and taking off some of the soil or not taking off some of the soil is going to be, the variabilities I feel going to be greater with me than it would be in the lab from a technician who's doing this day in and day out as a career. So I just take the whole sample from the surface to the 6 inch depth and send that in. Okay. All right, guys and gals, I appreciate everybody here today on the members only stream. I'll be back on Thursday. I'm not real sure if I'm going to be back on the Thursday after that. I think it's July 4th. That's still up in the air. It's a holiday. I might not be there for that one, but for this Thursday night, we'll continue into soil testing. We're going to get a little bit more detailed on some of the soil testing information this Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I appreciate everybody being here today. Thanks a bunch, guys, gals. Have a good one. See you Thursday night. Bye.